Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. My name is Beth, and if you're new, welcome. Today's quilt does not belong to me. I was visiting a friend recently and she said she had a quilt that needed some repair and would I be interested? And I said yes, I really would. I'd love to fix the quilt so that it can be used for a few more years. The binding was definitely in need of repair, and also there were only 3 areas of this patchwork that needed to be repaired. And so I began with the largest strip here that's coming apart, and what I did was I just took a piece of fabric left over from one of my projects, and I am going to applique that right over that open seam. After pressing those raw edges in, I just placed it over the area that's coming apart. So I'll be adding essentially another strip to the quilt design, and I'll tuck in both ends. And as I hand stitch around this strip, I will probably try to grab a little bit of that blue sashing fabric to give it a little more strength. It didn't take long at all to stitch around that strip and get it attached to my quilt. After I was done with that strip, I went to another area that was coming apart, and you can see underneath those strips there was a foundation that these strips were sewn onto. So that also gives this quilt makes it a little bit more sturdy. This time I pressed those edges in using that sashing as my guide there, so I would know where I need those diagonal folds, and I just pressed it right on top of the quilt. And after cutting away the fabric behind those angled folds, I also pressed the side edges so that this piece would be all prepared for my applique. Here's the last area that I need to repair, and it's here in the corner. So this time I got a triangle shaped piece of fabric, and I will just place that in the corner of this block and stitch around. The binding on this quilt had come apart. The quilter before that made this took the backing and rolled it to the front, and then they zigzagged around the binding area here, and it's all kind of coming apart. The fabric is worn, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out some of the stitches, and I will be trimming the quilt right along the quilt top and adding a new binding. The binding fabric I chose is similar to the original, quite a bit larger. These gingham red and white squares are quite a bit bigger, but I'm going to use this fabric that I had on hand, and I will cut my binding strips 2.5 inches wide. After joining all my binding strips together, I'm going to press this long piece of binding in half, and I will link below, I'll leave a link below in the description box, a video called Binding 101 if you want a little more detail on how to add the binding to your quilt. This time I'm attaching the binding to the back of my quilt. I left a little tail about 10 inches before I started attaching, and I will stop at the corner of the quilt, maybe a 1/4 inch away from the end, and then I will pivot with my needle down and I'll sew off the corner with that little tiny diagonal stitch right off the corner of the quilt. And then I will need to turn my quilt and start on the next side. I pulled the binding up and down to begin sewing on the next side, and I'll begin sewing right there at the top, right through that fold, and then I'll do the same thing on every corner. When I got all the way around, I stopped before getting to where I began, and I now have 2 tails. One tail on the left there is a little bit longer than the one on the right. I trimmed, and I want the edge of that right side to be right next to the fold, and I need at least 2.5 inches here on the left. I'll use that little piece of leftover binding for measuring, and now that folded piece there's 2.5 inches longer, and I'll put my right sides together just like I did when I was joining all of my strips. And this is called continuous binding. You don't know where the binding starts or ends, and I always double check after adding this seam to make sure that the binding is fitting around my quilt, if it's not too loose and not too tight. So before I cut that little triangle off, I will double check and make sure that my binding fits on the quilt. After making sure that it fits and I pinned it down, I finished sewing the binding on the back, and now I will turn my quilt over and top stitch. After rolling the binding to the front, I'll top stitch all the way around. This was a very satisfying project that didn't take long at all, and now this quilt is ready to be used again. It took a little bit of patching and a new binding, and this quilt is now ready to go. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.